So I'm going to talk about elections and a little bit of background on myself. I'm currently a county commissioner in Utah County, which is in the state of Utah in the United States. And prior to becoming a county commissioner, I was a county clerk, which means that I ran elections. And I ran elections in 2020. So I just barely came through the largest election in my lifetime in the United States, and probably one of the most controversial and disputed elections as well. And so what I want to talk about is free and honest elections. Free and honest elections are really the bedrock of freedom and self-governance. Without elections, we really don't have the ability as people, regardless of where we live in the world, to claim self-governance and to claim liberty or freedom. And the blockchain community, the essence of a blockchain community being a decentralized community is really the epitome of self-governance. And so I think free and honest elections are incredibly important to us as a community, more so I think than a lot of people throughout the world. I think everybody throughout the world understands this concept of elections and freedom, but really not necessarily this concept of self-governance and how that really is the bedrock of that liberty. So that brings me to the question, what are the elements of a free and honest election? You know, one of the elements of an election that some people overlook often is access to the ballot, the ability to cast your vote. People cast votes differently throughout the world. You think of oftentimes you'll see pictures on the news of people lined up. And in some countries, you dip your thumb in ink to show that you voted. And in other places, they have an electronic poll book where they mark in a computer system that you have voted. And yet others, there's a piece of paper that you come and check that you voted. But all of those, you're voting in person at the polls. One of the areas that often gets overlooked is access to be able to vote for people that don't have the ability to go stand in line. Maybe it's because they have socioeconomic constraints, because they have to be at work, and so they can't stand in line on election day. Or sometimes it's because they have a disability. If you're blind, oftentimes you can't see the ballot to fill it out. And so that takes away your ability to cast your vote independently and secretively. So access to being able to vote is incredibly important. Beyond access, we want to look at security. In an election, security is paramount. If the election is not secure, there's not even really a point in holding an election. I think that one's fairly self-explanatory. Another one is accuracy. The accuracy of the results of that election. Once again, if your election is inaccurate, you might as well not even hold one. And transparent. That was the really important one, and that's transparency. Transparency in elections, from the entire process on who can vote, all the way through how did ballots get cast, to how were those ballots counted and what were the results. Transparency is really what gives people the ability to have confidence in the result of those elections. And that's really the biggest point of the elements of a free and fair election, is voter confidence. I wrote an op-ed in March of 2020. Actually, it was published on the day of Super Tuesday, which Super Tuesday is a day that a lot of states choose do a presidential primary here in the United States. And so it's one of the big election day events leading up to a presidential election. And in the op-ed that I wrote in the newspaper, I talked about how voter confidence is key to a successful election. And one of the most important things when looking at an election is you don't actually have to hack an election in order to undermine voter confidence. You just have to convince people that you did. And the 2016 presidential election here in the United States is a really good example of that. If you walk around and you asked 20 people here in the United States, did Russia hack the 2020 presidential election, half of the people would probably say yes. And the interesting thing is, there's no evidence, there's no forensic evidence that any election in 2016 was actually hacked. However, Russia convinced people that they hacked the election. And so people all over the world, you heard all the time saying, well, in the 2016, Donald Trump won that election. They would say, Donald Trump isn't president, the Russians hacked the election. They never did. As an election official, we've gone through these audits, there's no evidence of hacking, but because people are convinced that it happened, it's almost as though it did. So voter confidence is key. Now, if the election systems in the United States were completely transparent, if people could verify themselves that their vote was counted correctly, then this risk of hacking or this risk of convincing people that an election was hacked that actually wasn't hacked is reduced to almost nothing. It's almost minuscule. And that's why transparency is so important. So then that begs the question, how does blockchain facilitate free and honest elections? So hopefully I've got your mind thinking about that a little bit, especially those of you that like myself are kind of blockchain nerds, where you can think, what are all of the use cases and how can this be done? So I want to talk about how blockchain facilitates free and honest elections, or how it potentially could. The first is access. I was the first person in the United States to use blockchain voting for overseas military and disabled members of the public. So in my jurisdiction, you can use your phone. There's an app that you can use on your phone that will record your vote in a permissioned blockchain that we then at our headquarters can print off a paper ballot of your vote and count it with all of our other votes. And this is available for 3 demographics right now. The first is overseas citizens. So people living in other countries, but that are valid voters in my jurisdiction. Obviously, they can't stand in line and dip their thumb in ink because they don't live here right now, but they still have a right to vote. So this gives them remote access to being able to vote, and they cast their vote electronically. They mark their ballot electronically. It's recorded in a blockchain with an anonymous hash. And then I can print off a ballot at headquarters when we're ready to tabulate all the votes. And then I can take that paper ballot and I can check the blockchain with the hash. I don't know whose ballot it is. I just know that it's a valid hash. And I can check that in the blockchain to say, did this ballot that I'm about to count print off like it was recorded in the blockchain? And then the voter on the other end, they know their hash and they can go check that same record that I'm checking to make sure that the ballot printed correctly, to make sure that it was recorded correctly. And this gives us the ability to allow people who live in other countries the ability to vote in our elections. We also do this same process for members of our military that are deployed. So deployed members of the military and their families, once again, can't always stand in line to vote on election day, but this gives them that opportunity. And the third demographic, and this is the one that I'm most passionate about, is people with disabilities, people who are blind and can't see a paper ballot, or people who have physical disabilities and can't make it to a polling location physically, or maybe they have a hard time holding a pencil. We actually had a lady during our pilot that voted using an iPad. She was 106 years old and her knuckles were huge because she's had arthritis for about 40 years. And she couldn't hold a pencil well enough to be able to mark the ovals on her ballot. But she was able to use an iPad to push the buttons on it. She didn't even need glasses. She could read it fine. She was able to read the ballot, scroll through, mark her choices, and submit that ballot. So blockchain really gives us the ability to open access to voters while still maintaining voter confidence. Security is another way. If every time you vote, if it is recorded in a blockchain, we know that that's an immutable record. And so that gives us the ability to say, I always like to tell people nothing is unhackable, and that includes a paper ballot. Paper with pen at paper and pen at the polls on election day is not hackable. But the blockchain is the best electronic record we have of ensuring an immutable record of cast ballots, of recorded ballots, so that people can't go back and change votes en masse and swing an election. So it really brings in an element of security that no other electronic form of voting has. As far as accuracy goes, it's the same. We have the ability with a blockchain to audit every vote that's cast. We can go back and check what is the accuracy of our count. If we counted all of these ballots, we have an immutable record that we can refer back to say, did we count these ballots correctly? And then obviously transparency. Transparency is going to be key moving forward. In the past, when it came to elections, people trusted the government authority to count the votes correctly. And if they couldn't trust the government authority, then you would have people from opposing sides come and count the ballot together. But this attitude of complete transparency, it used to say, if I can't trust the government, well, then I'm going to trust the poll watchers from the two opposing sides. But more and more today, people don't want to trust anyone, whether it be their government or the poll watchers. They want to be able to verify for themselves. And blockchain really creates this end-to-end transparency where people don't have to say, I'm going to rely on the poll watcher to make sure that my vote was counted correctly. This gives them the ability to say, I'm going to check my vote myself, and I'm going to ensure that my vote was counted correctly, and I'm going to have full confidence in that. So blockchain really has this ability to solve the major issues that we face with access, security, accuracy, and transparency. And those four things really are what lead to voter confidence. And voter confidence is what helps us ensure that we have a free and honest election. Now, as I wrap up, I want to talk about why people ask, why don't we already have blockchain voting? We've got some challenges to face. Challenge number one is we need to have good, solid technology, and that is developing. I know of at least six companies globally right now that are developing blockchain voting solutions. And I think that having 6 is fantastic. In fact, I would love to see 12 or 20. In the elections world and in the election space, having more people competing in this space, not only does it give us a drive to have better technology, but it actually gives us more security. If in the United States, for example, if we had 20 vendors that were doing elections and each state could pick their own vendor, so we had all of the states using a combination of 20 different vendors, that actually builds security into the system. So one of the challenges, there just aren't enough companies yet. The technology is not quite there. We've got about 6 that I know of. There's probably closer to 10, and maybe there's about a handful that I'm not aware of yet. But we need more companies in this space to come in and have competing technologies. So that's the first challenge. And the second challenge is so many people don't understand blockchain. There's just this basic level of maybe it's just that there's this mystery behind blockchain, or maybe there's just misconceptions about blockchain, but there's a lot of people that don't understand blockchain. And so they really either are hesitant to using it for our elections, or they fight using it for our elections. So that's another issue that we have there. Are people that don't really understand blockchain and are really fighting this. Along those lines, we have people that are just absolutely convinced that the most superior way to run election is paper at the polls on election day, and that there should be no alternative. And those people, while we need to work with them, and I as a fan, as an election official, I've always embraced an all of the above strategy. In my county, we mail every voter a ballot. We have early voting at the polls. We have election day voting at the polls, and we use electronic ballots for certain demographics. So I'm a fan of continuing to do paper at the polls, but as the younger generations start to become the dominant voting blocks, the younger generations will demand electronic solutions. In probably the next decade, we're going to start to see a real shift towards electronic voting. And as we do, I think blockchain's a good solution, but that's going to take time. So number one is we need more companies in this space. Number two is there's a lot of people that don't understand it. And then number three is we need time. We need time as the voting demographic wants to move away from paper towards electronic voting. So with that, I want to give all of you a challenge, and I want you to do a couple of things. Number one, so here's my challenge. Number one, think about ways that blockchain can facilitate free and honest elections. And then number two, talk to at least 3 friends about that. And particularly 3 friends that maybe don't understand blockchain. Because the sooner that people start to understand blockchain and how it can solve our issues facing elections and create free and honest elections, not just in the United States, but globally, then the sooner we can become a society that can have truly transparent, truly free and honest elections. Thank you.
Amelia, thank you so much. That was awesome. Before we transition to the next speaker, I need to just cover a couple things that GBA is doing specifically in the election space. And Amelia was part of an event that we did a couple months ago, I guess, where some of those folks that were not necessarily didn't see things the same way that Amelia saw it. And for those of you who saw that particular thing, it was quite entertaining. But one of the things that we're doing is we are now meeting with some of the folks that Amelia is referring to, and we're trying to get everybody on the same page. So one of the things that if you don't already know, GBA is a phenomenal forum to bring people together to get on the same page and get some harmony and unity, and hopefully work together to move forward. Secondly, the voting working group meets every Tuesday, I think at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, and is doing a great job of developing standards, because one of the things that's going to be critical for elections officials to be able to understand and have confidence in blockchain solutions is if we can get blockchain solutions certified by reputable, credible authorities. And we're working with EAC and different organizations and bodies to, right now we're putting together some recommendations to go into the next EAC document. So, and Amelia has been at the forefront. Amelia, do you want to share any thoughts or comments on those 2 subjects? And then I want to turn it over to our friends at Tom Labs.
Yeah, and in particular, the people you were talking about that are that we've joined forces with, and that's the folks that are of the mindset that the only acceptable way to vote is on paper at the polls on election day. So we were able to discuss this idea of blockchain or electronic voting with them, and once again, they really were pushing that there's only one way to vote, and that one way is going to be on paper. And I basically let them know that electronic voting is coming, and they can either be a part of the solution or we can just do it without them. And if they want to be part of the solution, then we want to work together because we want to have an election process that everybody can have confidence in. So Gerard is absolutely correct. Those folks stepped up, they've come to the table, and we are working together to try to create a group of standards that can be acceptable to everybody, even those that are hesitant about voting any other way than on paper. So that's really, really great. The other part of that is the series of standards that we're creating. We're not just creating it for the election officials. It's really twofold. Number one is those that want to create a technology solution. A lot of times the folks that have the skills and the expertise to create the technology solution don't have elections expertise. So these standards actually give them the ability to look at how elections are run. And if they're going to build a technology solution, it needs to be able to facilitate certain things. So it helps the technologists as well. And then on the flip side, as election officials, most of the election officials I know really aren't super tech savvy. And so it gives them, as they're looking at these potential solutions, as they're evaluating these 6 or 10 or 20 potential companies, it gives them a standard that they can evaluate those too. So I think the standards that we're creating here at GBA are absolutely imperative to moving to the next step of creating free and honest elections. Thank you, Gerard.